The shovel hit something solid. Reggie Thomas stopped mid-swing, the January cold biting at his face. He'd been digging alongside the old railway tracks in Genesee, Michigan for 3 hours. Routine excavation work for a new transit line. Nothing unusual. Just frozen dirt, rocks, and the occasional rusted railroad spike. But this was different. "Hey," he called out to his crew, "there's something down here." The scraping sound echoed as he cleared away more soil. Metal. Definitely metal. A box maybe 2 feet wide, buried 4 feet deep in earth that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Rust covered every inch of it, but there, etched into the top, were 2 initials that made his stomach drop. What they found inside would crack open a mystery that had haunted Michigan for 55 years. Winter, 1970. The red brick house on Maple Street sat quiet under a blanket of fresh snow. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin, lazy wisps that disappeared into the gray winter sky. Inside, the fireplace still glowed with warm embers. But Harold and Doris Chapman were gone. Their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, noticed it first. The Plymouth Fury hadn't moved in 3 days. The mailbox was overflowing, and Harold, punctual, reliable Harold who hadn't missed a day of work at the Ford plant in 28 years, hadn't shown up to his shift. When the sheriff's deputy finally entered through the unlocked back door, he found a scene that made no sense. Coffee cups on the kitchen table, still half full, plates set for breakfast, untouched. The fireplace, tended and warm. Doris's purse on the counter. $47 inside. Harold's wallet on the dresser. His car keys hanging by the door. Their winter coats, both of them, still in the closet. It was 5 degrees outside. No one walks away into a Michigan winter without a coat. No one leaves their money, their car, their entire life behind without a trace. And no one vanishes from a locked house with a warm fire still burning. But Harold and Doris Chapman did. For 55 years, their disappearance haunted the small community of Genesee. Theories swirled. Search parties combed the frozen woods. Investigators chased leads across state lines. But nothing. No bodies. No answers. Just an empty house and a mystery that refused to die. Until a backhoe operator hit a rusted metal box buried alongside abandoned railway tracks. Until forensic teams opened it and found a wedding ring engraved with the words, HD forever. Until DNA confirmed what one retired detective had suspected for half a century. This wasn't a disappearance. It was murder. And the person responsible had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Before we dive into what happened, if you're a true crime fan, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how this story ends. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Let's build this community together. They weren't wealthy. They weren't famous. They didn't have enemies or dark secrets, at least none that anyone in Genesee knew about. They were just ordinary. The kind of couple you'd see at the grocery store on Thursday afternoons or sitting in the third pew at Sunday service. But ordinary doesn't mean forgettable. Harold James Chapman was 52 years old in 1970. He'd worked the assembly line at the Ford plant in Flint for 28 years. Same shift, same station, same lunch break at noon. His co-workers described him as reliable, steady, the kind of guy who showed up 10 minutes early and never complained about overtime. He had calloused hands from decades of factory work, a slight limp from an old knee injury, and a habit of whistling while he worked. His favorite song? Stand By Me by Ben E. King. He'd hum it while fixing things around the house, while shoveling snow off the driveway, while tinkering with the Plymouth Fury he'd bought used in '67. Harold wasn't a talker. He kept to himself mostly, nodded hello to neighbors, helped shovel Mrs. Patterson's walkway when the snow got too deep. But he wasn't unfriendly, just quiet, reserved. A man who believed actions spoke louder than words. Doris Marie Chapman was 49. She worked as a secretary at Genesee Elementary School, a job she'd held for 11 years. Teachers loved her, parents trusted her. Kids knew her as the lady at the front desk who kept a jar of peppermints and always had a Band-Aid ready. She had a warm smile, graying brown hair she wore in a neat bun, and a voice that could calm even the most anxious parent during report card season. She baked pies for church fundraisers, apple, cherry, pecan, and her blueberry cobbler won second place at the county fair in '68. Doris was the opposite of Harold in some ways. She was chatty, social, the kind of person who remembered your birthday and asked about your grandkids. But she wasn't nosy. She didn't gossip. She just cared. They'd been married 26 years. No children. Doris had suffered 2 miscarriages in the early years of their marriage, and after the second one, they'd quietly accepted it would just be the 2 of them. They poured their love into their home instead. The garden Doris tended every spring. The bird feeder Harold built and hung in the backyard. The small routines that made their life together feel full. Their red brick house on Maple Street wasn't fancy. It had 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a modest kitchen with yellow wallpaper, and a living room with a stone fireplace Harold had repaired himself. The furniture was old, but well kept. Doris crocheted blankets that draped over the couch. Harold's toolbox sat in the corner of the garage, organized and ready. They were creatures of habit: church every Sunday at 10 in the morning, groceries every Thursday after Doris got off work, dinner at 6 sharp, pot roast on Mondays, meatloaf on Wednesdays, fish on Fridays. Harold read the newspaper after dinner while Doris washed dishes and listened to the radio. In the winter of 1970, life in Genesee moved slow. The Vietnam War dominated the evening news. Nixon was in the White House. The Beatles had just released Let It Be. But in their small corner of Michigan, the Chapmans lived a quiet, predictable life. Until they didn't. The last time anyone saw them was late on a Saturday afternoon in January. Mrs. Patterson waved to Doris as she brought in the mail. Harold was out front, scraping ice off the windshield of the Plymouth. He nodded back, his breath visible in the freezing air. By Monday morning, they were gone. Harold didn't show up to his shift at the Ford plant. The supervisor called the house. No answer. He called again an hour later. Still nothing. By noon, he contacted the sheriff's office. Doris didn't show up to work at the elementary school either. The principal tried calling. No answer. One of the teachers drove by the house during lunch. The car was in the driveway. Smoke was coming from the chimney. But no one came to the door. By Wednesday, the mailbox was overflowing. The newspaper sat untouched on the porch, buried under fresh snow. Neighbors started whispering. Maybe they went to visit family? But Harold never misses work. And Doris would have told someone. Did they have family? No, they didn't. Harold's brother had died in a car accident in '64. Doris's parents passed years earlier. They had a few distant cousins scattered across the Midwest, but no one they were close to. No one they'd visit without telling their jobs, their neighbors, their church. Something was wrong. And when the sheriff's deputy finally stepped inside that unlocked house and saw the half-drunk coffee, the untouched breakfast, the warm fireplace, and the winter coat still hanging in the closet, he knew. Harold and Doris Chapman hadn't left. They'd been taken. Or worse. The deputy's name was Tom Briggs. He was 26 years old, fresh out of the academy, and this was supposed to be a routine welfare check. It wasn't. He stood in the doorway of the Chapman house, his hand still on the knob, and felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The house was too still, too quiet, like it was holding its breath. Mr. Chapman? Mrs. Chapman? His voice echoed through the empty rooms. No response. He stepped inside, boots leaving wet prints on the linoleum floor. The kitchen was directly to his left. 2 coffee cups sat on the table, dark rings staining the bottoms. The coffee pot on the stove was half full, stone cold. 2 plates were set out, forks, napkins, everything ready for a meal that never happened. Briggs moved through the house slowly, methodically. The living room was neat, a crocheted blanket draped over the couch. A newspaper folded on the side table, dated 4 days earlier. The fireplace still held the remnants of a fire, logs burned down to ash and embers. but when he held his hand near the hearth, he could still feel faint warmth. Someone had tended this fire recently, maybe that morning, maybe the night before. He checked the bedrooms. Both beds were made, corners tucked tight. No suitcases missing from the closet, no drawers left open. Doris's purse sat on the dresser in the master bedroom. He opened it carefully, found her wallet, $47 in cash, her driver's license, a grocery list written in neat cursive. Harold's wallet was on the nightstand, $32, union card, a photo of Doris from their wedding day, edges worn from years of handling. The car keys hung on a hook by the back door, and the winter coats, both of them, hung in the hallway closet. Briggs stepped outside, checked the thermometer mounted by the back door. 5 degrees. Wind chill made it feel like -10. No one walks away in this weather without a coat. He radioed it in. Within an hour, the house was swarming with officers. Detective Frank Morrison arrived just after 3 in the afternoon. He was 43, a veteran investigator with the Genesee Police Department, and he'd seen his share of missing persons cases. Most of them ended with someone turning up at a relative's house or a motel 2 towns over, embarrassed and apologetic. But this one felt different. Morrison walked through the house twice, taking notes, asking questions, studying every detail. He opened cabinets, checked the basement, examined the locks on every door and window. No signs of forced entry. Not a single one. No broken glass. No scratched locks. No kicked-in doors. Whoever had been in this house, if anyone had been in this house, had either been let in or had a key. Morrison stood in the living room staring at the fireplace. The logs were positioned carefully, burned evenly. Someone had built this fire with intention. Someone had fed it, tended it, kept it going, and then they'd left. Or been taken. He pulled out his notebook, started writing. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, no blood, no disturbance, coats, wallets, keys, all here. Car and driveway, fireplace warm, coffee cold, last confirmed sighting, Saturday evening, approximately 5:30 p.m. He underlined the last part twice. That gave them a window. Sometime between Saturday evening and Monday morning, Harold and Doris Chapman had vanished. The investigation moved fast. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on every door within a 3-block radius. Did you see anything? Hear anything? Notice any strangers? Any unusual cars? Nothing. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor directly across the street, said she'd seen Doris collecting the mail on Saturday. Harold had been scraping ice off the car. Everything seemed normal. Another neighbor, Mr. Kowalski, said he'd heard their car start up around 7 that evening, but he didn't see where they went. Figured they were heading to the store or maybe church, but no one at the church had seen them, and the grocery store clerk didn't remember them coming in. Morrison organized search parties. Volunteers from the community, factory workers, teachers, church members, gathered at dawn and spread out through the woods behind the Chapman property. They walked in lines, shoulder to shoulder, calling out names that went unanswered. They checked abandoned buildings, old barns, sheds, anywhere 2 people could be hidden or held. Nothing. The Flint River ran along the edge of town, frozen solid under 2 feet of ice. Divers were put on standby waiting for the thaw. Tips started coming in. A woman in Ohio called, said she'd seen a couple matching their description at a rest stop. Officers drove 3 hours to check it out. Wrong couple. A man in Illinois reported seeing Harold's car, a Plymouth Fury, same color. Another dead end. A psychic from Detroit called, claimed she'd had a vision of the Chapmans in a cabin up north. Morrison sent 2 officers to check. The cabin was empty, hadn't been used in years. Weeks turned into months. By spring, the ice on the river had melted. Divers went in, searched the murky depths for bodies, for evidence, for anything. Nothing. Harold's paycheck sat uncashed at the Ford plant. Doris's position at the school was quietly filled by a substitute who eventually became permanent. The house sat empty, a for sale sign planted in the front yard by a distant cousin who'd inherited the property. The case file grew thicker. Interviews, reports, dead-end leads, but no answers. Morrison couldn't let it go. He'd sit in his office late at night, long after everyone else had gone home, and stare at the crime scene photos. The coffee cups, the fireplace, the coats in the closet. Something about it gnawed at him. This wasn't random. This wasn't a stranger abduction. This was planned. Calculated. Someone had known the Chapmans, known their routine, known they'd be home that weekend. Someone they trusted. He started making a list. Everyone who had access to the house. Everyone who knew them well enough to walk in without raising suspicion. Family, none living nearby. Co-workers, alibis checked, all cleared. Church members, dozens of names, all interviewed, nothing suspicious. Neighbors. Morrison paused, his pen hovering over the page. Neighbors. He flipped back through his notes, found the name he was looking for. Calvin Dawson. 28 years old, lived 3 houses down. Railway maintenance worker, single, quiet. Had keys to the Chapman house. Morrison had interviewed him back in February, just a few weeks after the disappearance. Dawson had been cooperative, polite, said he hadn't seen the Chapmans in a few days, figured they'd gone to visit family. But the Chapmans didn't have family. Morrison circled the name, made a note in the margin. Follow up. But there was no evidence. No probable cause. Just a gut feeling that something wasn't right. By the summer of 1971, the case was officially cold. The file was boxed up, stored in the basement of the police station alongside dozens of other unsolved cases. Morrison retired in '75, but he took copies of everything with him. Photos, reports, witness statements. He kept them in his basement, pinned to a corkboard, a constant reminder of the case he couldn't solve. For 55 years, the mystery of Harold and Doris Chapman remained just that, a mystery. Until a backhoe operator named Reggie Thomas hit a rusted metal box buried 4 feet deep alongside abandoned railway tracks. Until forensic teams opened it and found bones, fabric, and a wedding ring engraved with the words, HD forever. Until the truth finally came to light. Real quick, if you're hooked on this case like I am, smash that like button. It helps us share more stories like this. And tell me, what time is it where you are right now? I love knowing when you all tune in. Frank Morrison couldn't sleep. It was 1975, 5 years after the Chapmans vanished, and he was lying in bed at 2 a.m, staring at the ceiling, thinking about that fireplace. His wife Margaret rolled over, half asleep. Frank, you're doing it again. Doing what? Thinking about them. He didn't deny it. Morrison had retired from the Genesee Police Department 3 months earlier. He was 48 years old, had put in 25 years on the force, and by all accounts he'd earned his rest. His colleagues threw him a party. His captain gave a speech about dedication and service. His kids bought him a fishing rod. But retirement didn't feel like rest. It felt like failure. Because Harold and Doris Chapman were still missing. Still unsolved. Still haunting him. He'd brought the case files home. Copies, technically, since the originals were locked away in the station basement. Boxes of reports, photographs, witness statements, maps of the neighborhood. He set up a workspace in his basement, pinned everything to a corkboard, drew lines connecting names and dates and locations. Margaret didn't say anything at first. She understood. She'd been married to a cop long enough to know that some cases stayed with you. But weeks turned into months, and Morrison was spending more time in that basement than anywhere else. "Honey," she said one evening, standing at the top of the stairs, watching him shuffle through papers, "you've got to let it go." "I can't." "Why not?" He looked up at her, exhausted. "Because someone got away with it." And that was the truth Morrison couldn't escape. Someone had murdered Harold and Doris Chapman. Someone had walked into their house, killed them, disposed of their bodies, and walked away clean. Someone was still out there, living freely, maybe even sleeping soundly, while two innocent people were erased from existence. It ate at him. What haunted Morrison most wasn't just the lack of evidence, it was the details that didn't add up. The fireplace. He kept coming back to it. The logs had been carefully arranged, burned evenly, tended recently. Who builds a fire right before vanishing? Who takes the time to stoke the flames, add wood, make sure it's burning warm, and then walks out into sub-zero temperatures without a coat? No one. Unless someone else built that fire. Unless someone wanted it to look like the Chapmans had just stepped out for a moment. Then there was the coffee. 2 cups, half drunk, gone cold. Plates set out for breakfast. Everything interrupted mid-routine, mid-morning. That suggested surprise. An unexpected visitor, maybe. Or someone they knew well enough to let in without hesitation. And the coats. Morrison had checked the weather records for that weekend. Saturday night, the temperature dropped to 3 degrees. Sunday morning, -2. Wind chill made it feel like -15. No one survives that without proper clothing, which meant one of 2 things. Either the Chapmans left voluntarily and froze to death within minutes, or they never left at all. Morrison believed the latter. They'd been killed in that house, or taken from it by force. And whoever did it had keys. Because there was no forced entry, not a scratch on the locks, not a broken window, nothing. Whoever came into that house was let in, or already had access. Morrison pulled out his list of names again, the same list he'd made in '71. Everyone who had keys to the Chapman house. There was only one name. Calvin Dawson, 28 years old in 1970. Lived 3 houses down on Maple Street. Railway maintenance worker. Single. Quiet. Kept to himself. The Chapmans had trusted him. Given him a spare key so he could feed their cat and water their plants when they traveled. Dawson had helped Harold shovel snow a few times. Doris had baked him a pie once, thanked him for being a good neighbor. Morrison had interviewed him twice. Once in February of '70, right after the disappearance. Again in April following up. Both times Dawson had been calm, cooperative. Said he hadn't seen the Chapmans in a few days. Figured they'd gone to visit family. But they didn't have family. Morrison had noted that inconsistency in his report. But there was no evidence, no probable cause, just a feeling. And feelings don't hold up in court. So Morrison watched. Quietly, unofficially. He drove by Dawson's house a few times in '71. Saw him leaving for work, coming home, living his life. Nothing suspicious. In '72, Dawson moved. Packed up and left Genesee, relocated to Grand Rapids. Morrison noted the date, the timing. 2 years after the murders, if they were murders, and Dawson left town. Coincidence? Maybe. But Morrison didn't believe in coincidences. Over the next 5 decades, Morrison never stopped investigating. In the '80s, he tracked down old neighbors who'd moved away, re-interviewed them, asked if they remembered anything unusual about Calvin Dawson. Most didn't. A few said he was quiet, awkward, kept strange hours. One neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, remembered something odd. She'd seen Dawson loading something into his truck late one night in January of '70. A large canvas tarp, bundled up. She'd thought it was tools or equipment for work, but the timing matched. Morrison wrote it down, added it to his files. In the '90s, he started studying similar cold cases across the Midwest. Unsolved disappearances, missing couples. He attended conferences, talked to other retired detectives, compared notes. Nothing matched exactly. But the patterns were there. Trust. Access, opportunity. In the 2000s, Morrison learned to use a computer. His grandkids taught him. He digitized his files, created spreadsheets, cross-referenced railway employment records from 1970. Calvin Dawson had worked the night shift, had access to the railway maintenance yard, had tools, equipment, vehicles, had the means to bury bodies. Morrison was 75 years old, and he was still chasing a ghost. His wife passed away in 2003. Cancer. She'd been sick for a year, and in her final days, she'd looked at him with tired eyes and said, "Still thinking about that couple, aren't you?" He'd nodded. She'd smiled weakly. "I hope you find them, Frank. I hope you get your answer." He never did. Not while she was alive. His children worried about him. Staged an intervention in 2008. Sat him down, told him he needed to let it go, that it was consuming him, that he was 91 years old and needed to rest. He listened, nodded, thanked them, and then went back to his files. Because this wasn't about obsession. It wasn't about pride or stubbornness. It was about justice. Harold and Doris Chapman deserved justice. They deserved someone who wouldn't forget them, someone who wouldn't give up. And Frank Morrison refused to be the person who walked away. Every year on the anniversary of their disappearance, he called the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit, left messages, sent letters, reminded them that the case was still open, still unsolved, still waiting. Most of the time, no one called back. But he kept trying. In 2020, at 93 years old, Morrison moved into an assisted living facility. His kids insisted. He couldn't live alone anymore. His knees were shot, his eyesight failing, his hands shaking too much to write clearly. But his mind was sharp. He brought his files with him, boxes of them. The staff didn't know what to make of the old man in room 12 who spent hours every day poring over decades-old police reports. But Morrison didn't care what they thought. He had a theory. He'd always had a theory. Calvin Dawson killed Harold and Doris Chapman, took their money, buried their bodies somewhere near the railway yard, and lived the rest of his life pretending it never happened. Morrison had written it all down, every detail, every suspicion, every piece of circumstantial evidence. He kept it in a notebook, leather-bound, pages yellowed with age. On the first page, in his shaky handwriting, he'd written, "For whoever solves this, don't stop looking." And then, in January of 2025, his phone rang. It was a detective from the Michigan State Police, a woman named Sarah Huang. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I'm calling about the Chapman case." Morrison's heart stopped. "We found them." Reggie Thomas had been working construction and excavation for 15 years, and he'd dug up a lot of strange things. Old bottles, rusted car parts, a Civil War-era bayonet once, which ended up in a museum. But he'd never dug up a body. It was January 14th, 2025, Tuesday morning. The sky was gray, the air cold enough to sting, and Reggie was 3 hours into his shift when his backhoe hit something that shouldn't have been there. The site was an old stretch of land alongside abandoned railway tracks on the outskirts of Genesee. The Michigan Department of Transportation was planning a new transit line, and Reggie's crew had been hired to clear and excavate the area. Most of it was straightforward. Dirt, rocks, decades of overgrown weeds and rusted metal from the old railway days. But when the backhoe's bucket scraped across something solid, Reggie stopped. He climbed down, grabbed a shovel, and started digging by hand. Metal. Definitely metal. He cleared away more dirt, brushing it aside with his gloved hands. A box. Rectangular. Maybe 2 feet by 3 feet. Rusted beyond recognition, but intact. And there, etched into the top, were 2 letters. Initials. Reggie stood up, wiped his forehead, and called over his site supervisor. "You're gonna want to see this." Within 20 minutes, the site was shut down. Within an hour, the police arrived. Within 2 hours, the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit was on scene. Detective Sarah Huang was 38 years old, sharp-eyed, methodical, and she'd been working cold cases for 5 years. She'd seen her share of grim discoveries. Bodies in shallow graves, remains in abandoned wells, bones scattered by animals. But this was different. This was deliberate. The box had been buried carefully, 4 feet deep, wrapped in a rotted canvas tarp. hidden in a location that had been active railway property in the 70s but abandoned since the mid-80s. Whoever buried this knew the area, knew it wouldn't be disturbed. Huang crouched beside the box, studying it. The rust was thick, the metal corroded by decades underground. But the initials were still visible, carved deep into the surface. She pulled on latex gloves, motioned for the forensic team to move in. "Let's open it." They worked slowly, carefully, prying the lid loose without damaging whatever was inside. The hinges were rusted shut, but after several minutes of effort, the lid creaked open. The smell hit first, faint but unmistakable. Decay. Old death. Inside, wrapped in shreds of fabric, were bones. A skull. Partial. Fractured at the back. Long bones, ribs, a pelvis, and a ring. Huang leaned closer, her breath visible in the cold air. The ring was gold, tarnished but intact. She carefully lifted it, turned it over. Engraved on the inside were 4 words. HD, forever. Her pulse quickened. She motioned to one of the techs. "Bag this, and get me everything in this box cataloged immediately." As the forensic team worked, Huang stood and scanned the area. If there was one body, there might be another. "Bring in the ground-penetrating radar," she said. "Sweep a 50-foot radius." It took 3 hours, and then they found it. 10 feet east of the first burial site. No box this time, just bones wrapped in burlap, buried shallow. Male, early 50s, blunt force trauma to the skull. Huang didn't need dental records to know. This was Harold Chapman, and the woman in the box was Doris, 55 years. 55 years they'd been buried here, hidden alongside railway tracks that had long since been forgotten. Huang pulled out her phone, scrolled through her contacts, found the number she was looking for. Frank Morrison, retired detective, 98 years old, living in assisted care. She'd read his files, every single one. He'd donated them to the state police archives 5 years ago, hoping someone would pick up where he left off. And now she had. The phone rang twice before a nurse answered. "Willowbrook Assisted Living, how can I help you?" "I need to speak with Frank Morrison. It's urgent." "May I ask who's calling?" "Detective Sarah Huang, Michigan State Police. It's about a case he worked in 1970. There was a pause, then, "Hold on." Huang waited, her heart pounding. A minute later, a frail voice came on the line. "This is Frank Morrison." "Mr. Morrison, my name is Detective Sarah Huang. I'm with the Cold Case Unit. I'm calling about Harold and Doris Chapman." Silence. Then barely a whisper. "You found them." "Yes, sir. We found them." Morrison's breath hitched. Huang could hear it through the phone. 55 years of waiting, of wondering, of refusing to give up, all crashing down in a single moment. "Both of them?" he asked. "Both of them." Another pause. Longer this time. "Where?" "Railway tracks, old maintenance yard on the east side of Genesee, buried 4 feet deep." Morrison let out a sound, half laugh, half sob. "I knew it," he said. "I knew it was someone with access to that yard." Huang glanced at the excavation site, at the forensic team carefully extracting bones, cataloging evidence. "Mr. Morrison, I've read your files, all of them. You had a suspect. Calvin Dawson." "Yes, sir." "Did you find him?" "Not yet, but we will." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was stronger. He had keys to their house. He worked nights at the railway. He knew their schedule. I interviewed him twice, and both times, something felt off. I couldn't prove it. But I knew. "I believe you," Huang said. "And I'm going to finish what you started." "Thank you," Morrison whispered. "Thank you." Huang ended the call, slipped her phone back into her pocket, and turned to her team. "Run everything," she said. "DNA, dental records, forensic analysis. I want cause of death, time of burial, and any trace evidence we can pull. And find me everything we have on a man named Calvin Dawson. Last known address, employment history, family, everything. One of the techs looked up. You think he's still alive? He'd be 83 now, Huang said. So yeah, there's a chance. The forensic team worked through the night. By morning, they had preliminary results. Victim 1, female, late 40s, blunt force trauma to the posterior skull, single blow, likely died instantly. Victim 2, male, early 50s, blunt force trauma to the skull, defensive wounds on both forearms. He'd fought back. Time of death, consistent with late January 1970. Dental records confirmed their identities. Harold James Chapman, Doris Marie Chapman, murdered, buried, forgotten. Until now. The media picked up the story within hours. Local news stations ran it first. 55-year-old cold case solved. Bodies found in Genesee. Then the national outlets, CNN, Fox, NBC. By the end of the week, the story was everywhere. And in Grand Rapids, an 83-year-old man named Calvin Dawson watched the news and felt his stomach drop. Okay, this is where it gets intense. If you're not subscribed yet, do it now because what happens next will blow your mind. Also, comment below. What's the weather like where you are today? Just curious. The forensic lab at the Michigan State Police headquarters in Lansing was buzzing. Dr. Patricia Owens had been a forensic anthropologist for 23 years, and she'd examined hundreds of skeletal remains. But there was something about this case, the age of it, the deliberate burial, the fact that someone had gotten away with murder for over half a century, that made her work feel urgent. She laid out the bones on 2 separate examination tables, Doris on the left, Harold on the right. The damage was obvious. Doris's skull showed a single point of impact on the posterior side, the back of the head. The fracture pattern radiated outward, consistent with a heavy, blunt object, a hammer maybe, or a tire iron, something solid, swung with force. She'd never seen it coming. Harold's injuries were different. His skull showed trauma as well, but his forearms told a more violent story. Defensive wounds, fractures on both the left and right ulna, the kind you get when you raise your arms to block a blow. He'd fought back. Dr. Owens dictated her findings into a recorder, her voice steady and clinical. Victim 1, female, approximately 45 to 50 years old at time of death. Single blunt force trauma to the occipital bone. No defensive wounds. Likely attacked from behind. Death would have been instantaneous, or near instantaneous. She moved to the second table. Victim 2, male, approximately 50 to 55 years old. Multiple blunt force injuries. Defensive fractures on both forearms. Trauma to the parietal bone. Victim was conscious and fighting during the attack. Cause of death. Blunt force trauma resulting in catastrophic brain injury. She paused the recorder, stepped back, and looked at both tables. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. Someone had walked into that house, attacked Doris first, quick, efficient from behind, and then turned on Harold. Harold had seen it happen, had tried to fight, had tried to protect his wife, or himself, or both, and he'd lost. Dr. Owens sent her report to Detective Huang within the hour. Huang read it twice, her jaw tight. Then she turned her attention to the other evidence. The metal box had been a treasure trove. Decades underground had degraded most of the organic material, but not all of it. Shreds of fabric, floral pattern consistent with women's clothing from the 1970s, had been preserved in the sealed environment. Forensic techs carefully extracted fibers, cataloged them, sent them for analysis. The wedding ring had been cleaned, photographed, documented. The engraving was clear. HD forever. But it was the box itself that held the key. The initials carved into the top weren't just decorative. They were a signature, a mark of ownership. Huang had seen it before. Workers in the 60s and 70s often engraved their tools, their toolboxes, their equipment. It was a way to prevent theft, to mark what was yours. This box had belonged to someone. someone with the initials that matched those carvings. The forensic team dusted the box for prints. Most of it was too degraded, too rusted. But on the interior of the lid, protected from the elements, they found something. A partial print. Thumb, right hand. It wasn't much, maybe 60% of a full print, but it was enough. They ran it through the Michigan Automated Fingerprint Identification System. No hits. They expanded the search, national database. Still nothing. Huang wasn't surprised. If the killer had no prior criminal record, their prints wouldn't be in the system. But that didn't mean they couldn't find a match. She pulled up the case file Morrison had compiled, flipped through the pages until she found the list of names. People who had access to the Chapman house, people who worked at the railway, people who lived on Maple Street in 1970. One name appeared on all three lists. Calvin Douglas Dawson. Huang ran a background check. Current address, Grand Rapids, Michigan. Age, 83. No criminal record. Retired. Widower. Still alive. She picked up the phone, called the Grand Rapids Police Department, requested surveillance. I need eyes on this address, 24/7. Do not approach. Just watch. What are we looking for? The officer on the other end asked. A murderer, Huang said. While surveillance was being set up, Huang focused on building the case. She pulled Calvin Dawson's employment records from 1970. Railway maintenance worker, night shift, hired in 67, quit in 72. 2 years after the Chapmans disappeared, he'd left town. She cross-referenced his work schedule with the timeline of the murders. He'd been on shift the weekend the Chapmans vanished. Worked Saturday night, off Sunday, back on Monday. Plenty of time to kill them, bury them, clean up. She pulled his financial records next. It took some digging. Most banks didn't digitize records from the 70s until the 2000s, but she found them. January 1970. Calvin Dawson was $2,400 in debt, behind on rent, barely scraping by. March 1970. Debt paid off, in full, cash. Huang leaned back in her chair, staring at the numbers. Where did a railway maintenance worker making minimum wage get $2,400 in cash? She pulled Harold Chapman's financial records. Savings account at Genesee Credit Union, $12,000. In 1970, that was a fortune. Enough to buy a car, put a down payment on a house, live comfortably for years. And it had never been touched, because Harold was dead before he could withdraw it. But someone had tried. Huang found a record. A withdrawal attempt made in February of 70. $12,000. Signature on the withdrawal slip, Harold Chapman. But the bank had flagged it. The handwriting didn't match. The teller had refused the transaction, noted it in the file, and reported it to the police. Morrison had investigated. The trail went cold. But now, Huang had a theory. Calvin Dawson had killed the Chapmans for their money. He'd tried to withdraw Harold's savings and failed, so he'd settled for whatever cash they had in the house, enough to pay off his debts. And then he'd buried them and walked away. Huang needed one more piece. She called the forensic lab. I need a DNA comparison. Trace evidence from the victim's clothing against a known sample. Do you have a known sample? The tech asked. Not yet, but I will. She sent 2 officers to Grand Rapids with a simple mission. Get a DNA sample from Calvin Dawson without him knowing. It took 3 days. They followed him to a coffee shop, watched him order, watched him sit by the window, sipping slowly, staring out at the street. When he left, they moved in. The coffee cup was still on the table, half full. Lipstick, no, just moisture, on the rim. They bagged it, sent it to the lab. 48 hours later, the results came back. DNA match. 99.7% probability. Calvin Dawson's DNA was on Doris Chapman's clothing. Huang stood in the lab staring at the report, her hands trembling. 55 years. 55 years this man had walked free. Not anymore. She picked up the phone, called the prosecutor's office. I need an arrest warrant, 2 counts of murder, Calvin Douglas Dawson. Do you have enough? The prosecutor asked. Huang looked at the evidence spread across her desk. The DNA, the fingerprints, the financial records, the timeline, Morrison's notes. Yeah, she said. We've got him. The warrant was signed within hours, and on March 15, 2025 at 6 in the morning, a team of officers surrounded a small house in Grand Rapids. Detective Huang stood at the front door, her hand raised, ready to knock. This was it. 55 years of waiting. 55 years of silence. It was about to end. She knocked. Footsteps inside. Slow, shuffling. The door opened. Calvin Dawson stood there in a bathrobe, his face pale, his eyes wide. Calvin Douglas Dawson, Huang said, her voice steady. You're under arrest for the murders of Harold and Doris Chapman. For a moment, he just stared at her. Then he whispered, that was a lifetime ago. Not a denial, not confusion, just acknowledgement. Huang stepped forward, pulled out her handcuffs. Turn around. He did. And as the cuffs clicked into place, she leaned close and said, Frank Morrison says hello. Calvin Dawson's public defender was a woman named Rebecca Marsh. She was 42, overworked, underpaid, and handling 3 other cases simultaneously. But she took her job seriously, even when her clients were guilty. She sat across from Dawson in a private meeting room at the county jail, a stack of files between them. Mr. Dawson, I need you to be honest with me, she said. Did you kill Harold and Doris Chapman? He stared at the table, said nothing. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. Still nothing. Marsh sighed, flipped open the top file. The evidence against you is substantial. DNA, fingerprints, financial records showing you paid off significant debt right after they disappeared. Your own statements to police, they shouldn't have trusted me. That was a lifetime ago. A jury is going to hear all of that. Dawson's hands, cuffed and resting on the table, trembled slightly. If you cooperate, Marsh continued, if you tell me what happened, we might be able to negotiate. Plead down to manslaughter. Argue diminished capacity due to your age and health. But I need something to work with. Dawson finally looked up. His eyes were red, tired. I needed the money, he said quietly. Marsh froze. What? I needed the money. I was drowning. Rent. Bills. I couldn't keep up. So you killed them? He didn't answer directly, just stared at his hands. They trusted me, he said. They gave me a key. They thought I was their friend. Were you? A long pause. No. Marsh wrote that down. Then, what happened that day? Dawson closed his eyes. I went over on a Sunday morning, told them I wanted to borrow some tools. They let me in. Doris was making coffee. Harold was reading the paper. And I hit her first, from behind. She didn't see it coming. Marsh's pen stopped moving. Harold tried to fight. He came at me. We struggled. I hit him too, multiple times. He wouldn't go down. What did you use? A tire iron. From my truck. Where is it now? I threw it in the river 55 years ago. Marsh sat back, processing. This was a confession. A full, detailed confession. Why are you telling me this now? Dawson opened his eyes, looked at her. Because I'm 83 years old. Because I'm tired. Because I've been carrying this for 55 years and I can't anymore. You understand that if you confess, you'll spend the rest of your life in prison. I know. You'll die there. I know. Marsh closed her file. Then we'll enter a guilty plea. I'll argue for leniency based on your age and your cooperation. But Mr. Dawson, you need to understand. This is a death sentence. Maybe not legally, but practically. You're not walking out of prison. I haven't walked free in 55 years, Dawson said quietly. I've been in prison this whole time. Just nobody knew it but me. Marsh reported the confession to the prosecutor's office immediately. But there was a problem. Dawson's children hired a private attorney, a sharp, expensive lawyer named Gerald Finch who specialized in defending the elderly. Finch reviewed the case, reviewed the confession, and filed a motion to suppress. "My client is 83 years old," Finch argued in court. "He has early-stage dementia documented by his physician. He was interrogated without proper consideration for his mental state. His confession is unreliable." The prosecutor, a veteran named Linda Cortez, fired back. He was read his rights. He requested a lawyer. The interrogation stopped. His subsequent confession to his public defender was voluntary. He's been deemed competent to stand trial by 2 independent psychologists. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Rosenberg, reviewed the medical records, the interrogation transcripts, the competency evaluations. "Motion denied," she said. "The confession stands, but given the defendant's age and health, I'm ordering a full medical evaluation before trial. If he's not competent, we'll revisit." The evaluation took 2 weeks. 3 doctors examined Dawson. Cognitive tests, memory assessments, psychological evaluations. The results? Early-stage dementia, yes, but competent, aware of the charges, able to assist in his own defense. The trial would proceed. Finch changed tactics. "We're pleading not guilty," he told the court. Marsh, the public defender, was removed from the case. Finch took over completely. And suddenly, Calvin Dawson's story changed. In a pre-trial interview, Finch claimed his client had been coerced, confused, that the confession was the result of pressure and fear, not truth. "My client is an elderly man with memory issues," Finch told reporters outside the courthouse. He was scared. He said what he thought the police wanted to hear, but he didn't kill anyone. Detective Huang watched the press conference from her office, her jaw clenched. "He confessed," she said to her partner. "He gave details only the killer would know." "Doesn't matter," her partner said. "Finch is going to argue it away, make the jury feel sorry for him." Huang knew he was right. This wasn't going to be easy. The prosecution prepared meticulously. Linda Cortez built her case around the physical evidence, the DNA, the fingerprints, the financial records, the timeline. She lined up expert witnesses, forensic anthropologists, DNA analysts, financial investigators. And she had Morrison's files, 55 years of investigation, all pointing to one man. But Finch had a strategy too. He focused on reasonable doubt. "Where's the murder weapon?" he asked in pre-trial motions. "Where's the proof my client forged bank signatures? Where's the witness who saw him commit this crime?" "Circumstantial evidence," Cortez countered, "but overwhelming. DNA doesn't lie. Fingerprints don't lie." "Contamination," Finch shot back. 55-year-old evidence. How do we know it wasn't compromised?" Judge Rosenberg listened to both sides, then made her ruling. "The evidence is admissible. The trial will proceed. Both sides will have the opportunity to present their case to the jury." The trial date was set, June 2nd, 2025. In the weeks leading up to it, the media coverage intensified. True crime podcasts dissected every detail. Cable news ran specials. Social media exploded with opinions. Some people believed Dawson was guilty, a monster who'd hidden in plain sight for decades. Others felt sympathy. An old man, confused, being railroaded by a system desperate for closure. The community of Genesee was divided. Elderly residents who remembered the Chapmans wanted justice, wanted Dawson to pay for what he'd done. But some of Dawson's neighbors in Grand Rapids defended him. "He's a quiet man, a good man. This doesn't make sense." His children were torn. His daughter released a statement. "We love our father, but if he did this, we can't defend it. We're praying for the truth." His son refused to comment. His grandchildren struggled to reconcile the man they knew, the quiet grandfather who attended their school plays and sent birthday cards, with the man accused of murder. Detective Huang spent those weeks reviewing every piece of evidence, every statement, every detail. She visited Morrison's grave, stood there in the quiet cemetery, the wind rustling through the trees. "We're almost there," she said aloud. "Just a little longer." She thought about Harold and Doris, about the life they'd lived, the trust they'd placed in the wrong person. She thought about Morrison, about 55 years of obsession, of refusal to give up. And she thought about Dawson, about a man who'd killed 2 people for money, buried them like garbage, and lived freely while their families suffered. No more. On June 1st, the day before the trial, Huang received a package. It was from Morrison's daughter. Inside was a videotape. Old, labeled in Morrison's handwriting. "For the trial, if it ever happens." Huang played it. The screen flickered. Then Morrison's face appeared. Younger, maybe 70 years old, sitting in his basement surrounded by files. "My name is Frank Morrison," he said. "I was the lead detective on the Chapman case in 1970. If you're watching this, it means the case has been solved. It means someone finally listened." He paused, his eyes intense. "I knew someone close to them did this. I knew it in my bones. Calvin Dawson had access. He had motive. He had opportunity. I couldn't prove it then, but I never stopped believing." Morrison leaned closer to the camera. Harold and Doris Chapman were good people. They didn't deserve what happened to them. And whoever is prosecuting this case, don't let him get away with it. Not again. The video ended. Huang sat in silence, the weight of 55 years pressing down on her. Then she picked up the phone and called Linda Cortez. "I have something you need to see. June 2nd, 2025. The Genesee County Circuit Courthouse was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Overflow crowds gathered in a separate room with a video feed. News vans lined the street outside, reporters doing live shots, cameras trained on the entrance. This wasn't just a trial. It was the closing of a 55-year-old wound. Inside courtroom 3, the atmosphere was tense. Judge Patricia Rosenberg sat at the bench, her expression stern, her gavel within reach. To her left, the jury box held 12 people, 8 women, 4 men, who'd been selected after 3 days of questioning. They ranged in age from 27 to 68. None of them had been alive in 1970. At the prosecution table sat Linda Cortez, flanked by 2 assistant prosecutors and Detective Sarah Huang. Files, binders, and evidence boxes were stacked neatly in front of them. At the defense table sat Calvin Dawson, dressed in a gray suit that hung loose on his frail frame. Beside him was Gerald Finch, his attorney, looking confident and composed. Dawson stared straight ahead, his face blank. Judge Rosenberg banged her gavel. "We're on the record. The people of Michigan versus Calvin Douglas Dawson, 2 counts of second-degree murder. Ms. Cortez, your opening statement." Linda Cortez stood, buttoned her blazer, and walked to the center of the courtroom. She looked at the jury. 55 years ago, she began, her voice clear and steady, Harold and Doris Chapman were murdered in their home. They were beaten to death with a tire iron, their bodies buried in shallow graves near railway tracks, and their killer walked free. For 55 years, their families had no answers. Their community had no closure. And their murderer lived a quiet, unremarkable life, believing he'd gotten away with it. She paused, letting the words sink in. But he didn't. Because the evidence doesn't lie. DNA doesn't forget. And justice, even when delayed, will not be denied. Cortez walked to the evidence table, picked up a photograph of Harold and Doris, smiling, alive. These were good people, hardworking, trusting. They gave the defendant a key to their home. They considered him a neighbor, maybe even a friend. And he betrayed that trust in the most horrific way imaginable. She set the photo down, picked up another. The rusted toolbox, the initials carved into the top. This is where Doris Chapman's body was found, in the defendant's toolbox, buried 4 feet underground, her skull fractured, her wedding ring still on her finger. She held up the ring, let the jury see it. Harold fought back. His forearms were broken from trying to defend himself. But he couldn't, because the defendant was younger, stronger, and armed. Cortez turned to face Dawson. The defendant needed money. He was in debt, desperate. So he killed 2 innocent people, took their cash, and tried to steal more from their bank account. When that failed, he buried them and moved on with his life. She walked back to the jury. Over the next few days, you're going to hear from forensic experts. You're going to see DNA evidence that places the defendant at the scene. You're going to see financial records that show motive. And you're going to hear the defendant's own words. They shouldn't have trusted me. Cortez's voice dropped, became quieter, but more intense. Harold and Doris Chapman have been waiting 55 years for justice. Don't make them wait any longer. She sat down. Judge Rosenberg nodded. Mr. Finch, your opening statement. Gerald Finch stood, adjusted his tie, and approached the jury with a sympathetic smile. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is tragic. 2 people died 55 years ago, and that's heartbreaking. But tragedy doesn't equal guilt. And the prosecution's case is built on speculation, desperation, and 55-year-old evidence that's been compromised, contaminated, and manipulated to fit a narrative. He gestured toward Dawson. My client is 83 years old. He has early-stage dementia. He's confused, scared. And when the police came to his door and accused him of a crime from half a century ago, he said things that the prosecution is now twisting into a confession. Finch walked to the evidence table, picked up a photo of the toolbox. This box, the prosecution says it belonged to my client because of 2 initials carved into it. But how many people in 1970 had those same initials? Dozens? Hundreds? This isn't proof. It's a guess. He set the photo down. The DNA evidence, 55 years old, buried underground, exposed to moisture, bacteria, contamination. The prosecution wants you to believe it's reliable. But is it? Can it be? Finch turned back to the jury. And the so-called motive? My client paid off some debts in 1970. So what? Maybe he got a loan. Maybe he saved up. Maybe a relative helped him. Paying off debt doesn't make you a murderer. He walked closer to the jury box, his voice softening. The prosecution wants you to convict an elderly man based on circumstantial evidence and fear. But that's not justice. That's a witch hunt. And I'm asking you, begging you to see through it. He sat down. Judge Rosenberg looked at the prosecution. Call your first witness. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution called expert after expert. Dr. Patricia Owens, the forensic anthropologist, testified about the injuries, the blunt force trauma, the defensive wounds, the manner of death. These were not accidents, she said. These were deliberate, violent attacks. The DNA analyst testified about the match. Dawson's DNA on Doris's clothing. 99.7% probability. There is no reasonable doubt, she said. This DNA belongs to the defendant. The fingerprint expert testified about the partial print on the toolbox. It matches the defendant's right thumb. The ridge patterns are consistent. The financial investigator testified about the debt payoff, the timing, the cash. The defendant went from being $2,400 in debt to debt-free in 6 weeks. The same 6 weeks Harold and Doris Chapman were missing. Detective Huang testified about the investigation, the discovery, the evidence. Morrison's files. Detective Morrison spent 55 years on this case, she said, and every piece of evidence he collected pointed to one person, Calvin Dawson. Finch cross-examined aggressively. He questioned the DNA. Isn't it possible this sample was contaminated? No, the analyst said. We took every precaution. He questioned the fingerprint. Isn't a partial print less reliable than a full print? It's still a match, the expert said. He questioned the financial records. Isn't it possible Mr. Dawson had other sources of income? There's no record of it, the investigator said. But Finch planted seeds of doubt, small ones, tiny cracks in the prosecution's case. Then the defense called its witnesses. A psychologist testified about Dawson's dementia. He's confused, suggestible. His memory is unreliable. A character witness, a former co-worker, testified about Dawson's nature. He was quiet, kept to himself, never violent. Dawson's daughter testified, tears streaming down her face. My father is a good man. He's not capable of this. And then, against his attorney's advice, Calvin Dawson took the stand. The courtroom went silent. Dawson walked slowly to the witness box, his hands shaking. He was sworn in, sat down, and looked at the jury. Finch asked him directly, "Did you kill Harold and Doris Chapman?" Dawson's voice was barely a whisper. "No." "Did you bury their bodies?" "No." "Do you know how your DNA ended up on Doris Chapman's clothing?" I don't know. Maybe I helped her with something once. Carried groceries. I don't remember." "Do you remember confessing to your public defender?" Dawson hesitated. "I was scared. I said what I thought they wanted to hear." Finch nodded, satisfied. No further questions. Linda Cortez stood for cross-examination. She walked slowly toward the witness stand, her eyes locked on Dawson. "Mr. Dawson, you said you don't remember confessing, but you gave specific details. You said you hit Doris from behind. You said Harold fought back. You said you used a tire iron. How did you know those details if you didn't do it?" Dawson stammered. I must have heard it somewhere. On the news. The details of the injuries weren't released to the public." Silence. "You also said, and I quote, 'They shouldn't have trusted me.' What did you mean by that?" "I don't know. I was confused." "You said, 'I needed the money.' What money?" "I don't remember saying that." Cortez picked up a transcript, read from it. Quote, "I needed the money. I was drowning." "Those are your words, Mr. Dawson. What money were you talking about?" Dawson's face went pale. "I don't know." "You don't know? Or you don't want to say?" "I don't remember." Cortez leaned closer. "You remember enough to say you didn't do it, but you don't remember confessing? You don't remember the details you gave? Convenient." "I'm old," Dawson said, his voice breaking. "I'm confused." "You're 83, but you were 28 when you killed them. You weren't confused then, were you?" "I didn't kill them." "Then why is your DNA on Doris's clothing? Why are your fingerprints on the box her body was buried in? Why did you pay off all your debts right after they disappeared?" Dawson said nothing. Cortez stared at him. "You killed them. You know it. I know it. And this jury knows it." "Objection!" Finch shouted. "Sustained," Judge Rosenberg said. "Ms. Cortez, stick to questions." Cortez stepped back. No further questions. Dawson left the stand, his face ashen. Closing arguments came 2 days later. Cortez was powerful, emotional. She walked the jury through every piece of evidence, every inconsistency in Dawson's testimony, every reason to convict. He had the means, he had the motive, he had the opportunity, and he confessed. Don't let him hide behind age and confusion. Harold and Doris deserve justice. Finch was equally passionate. He focused on doubt, on the age of the evidence, on the possibility of error. If you have even the smallest doubt, you must acquit. That's the law. And there's plenty of doubt here. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. On June 28th, they returned. The courtroom was silent as the jury foreman stood. Judge Rosenberg asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of second-degree murder in the death of Doris Chapman, how do you find?" "Guilty." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. "On the charge of second-degree murder in the death of Harold Chapman, how do you find?" "Guilty." Dawson's head dropped. His daughter sobbed. Detective Huang closed her eyes, exhaled. 55 years. Finally, Frank Morrison never saw the verdict. He passed away on May 3, 2025 at 98 years old, just weeks before the trial began. But he died knowing the truth. His daughter was at his bedside when Detective Huang called with the news of the arrest. She'd held the phone to his ear, and Morrison, frail, barely able to speak, had smiled. "I knew it," he'd whispered. "I always knew." Those were some of his last words. At his funeral, his family spoke about a man who dedicated his life to justice. A man who couldn't let go, even when everyone else had moved on. A man who believed that Harold and Doris Chapman deserved better than to be forgotten. He carried that case with him every single day for 55 years, his son said, standing at the podium. It consumed him, but he was right. And now finally he can rest. 3 months after the verdict, the Genesee Police Department held a small ceremony. They unveiled a bronze plaque in the station lobby, right by the entrance where every officer would see it. It read, "Detective Frank Morrison never gave up." Beneath it was a photo of Morrison from 1970, standing outside the Chapman house, notebook in hand, determined. Detective Huang attended the ceremony. She stood in front of that plaque for a long time, thinking about the man who'd started this fight, and the 2 people who'd been waiting 55 years for someone to finish it. On August 2nd, 2025, Harold and Doris Chapman were finally laid to rest. The memorial service was held at Genesee Community Church, the same church they'd attended every Sunday morning in 1970. The same wooden pews, the same stained glass windows, the same quiet reverence. Over 200 people attended. Elderly neighbors who remembered the Chapmans, community members who'd followed the case, investigators who'd worked to solve it. Even some of Morrison's family came, honoring the man who'd never given up. The Reverend stood at the pulpit, his voice steady and warm. 55 years ago, Harold and Doris Chapman disappeared from this community. For 55 years we wondered, we prayed, we hoped for answers. And now, at long last, they've come home. He paused, looked out at the congregation. Harold and Doris were good people. They lived quiet, humble lives. They trusted their neighbors. They believed in kindness, and that trust was betrayed in the most unimaginable way. But today, we honor them, we remember them, and we lay them to rest with the dignity they always deserved. After the service, their caskets were carried to Evergreen Cemetery just outside of town. They were buried side by side under a large oak tree, their headstones simple but elegant. Harold James Chapman, beloved husband, 1918-1970. Doris Marie Chapman, beloved wife, 1921-1970. Together forever. People lingered at the graveside long after the ceremony ended. Some left flowers, others stood in silence, paying their respects to 2 people they'd never met but would never forget. Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter was there. Her grandmother had passed years ago, but she remembered the stories. "My grandma talked about them until the day she died," she said quietly. "She always said something wasn't right. I'm glad she was heard." In Genesee, the red brick house on Maple Street still stands. Different owners live there now. A young couple with 2 kids who had no idea of the history when they bought it. But after the trial, after the news coverage, after the truth came out, they learned. They were horrified at first, but then they did something unexpected. They reached out to the community, asked if it would be appropriate to place a small memorial plaque on the property. The response was overwhelming. Yes, absolutely. Harold and Doris should be remembered. The plaque was installed in the front yard near the walkway. It reads, "In memory of Harold and Doris Chapman, who lived here and were taken too soon. May they rest in peace." It's become a quiet landmark. People drive by slowly. Some stop, take photos, leave flowers. The house is no longer a place of mystery. It's a place of remembrance. Calvin Dawson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His 3 children released a joint statement the day after the verdict. "We are devastated. We loved our father, but we cannot defend his actions. What he did was unforgivable. We pray for the Chapman family, for the community of Genesee, and for everyone affected by this tragedy. We hope that this verdict brings some measure of peace. His grandchildren struggled the most. One of them, a college student, posted on social media, "How do you reconcile the grandfather who taught you to ride a bike with the man who murdered 2 innocent people? I don't have an answer. I don't know if I ever will." Dawson is currently incarcerated at a state facility in southern Michigan. He's in a medical unit due to his age and health. He'll likely die there. He's never spoken publicly since the trial. The case became a turning point in how cold cases are handled in Michigan. Advances in forensic science, DNA analysis, fingerprint databases, ground-penetrating radar prove that even 55-year-old cases can be solved. The Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit received increased funding. More investigators were hired, more cases were reopened, and families who'd been waiting decades for answers finally had hope. Detective Huang was promoted. She continues to work cold cases, inspired by Morrison's refusal to give up. "Every victim deserves someone who won't forget them," she said in an interview. "Frank Morrison taught me that." The story of Harold and Doris Chapman is a reminder that evil can hide in plain sight for decades, that trust can be weaponized by those with dark intentions, that a quiet neighbor, a helpful hand, a familiar face can conceal unimaginable darkness. But it's also a reminder that justice, even when delayed by 55 years, still matters. That investigators like Frank Morrison, who refuse to let go, can change everything. That communities never truly forget. And that 2 people who were erased from the world in 1970 are now remembered, honored, and finally at peace. Harold and Doris Chapman waited 55 years for justice. And in the end, they got it. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who loves true crime. Subscribe for more cases like this. We upload every week. And let me know in the comments. Do you think cold cases should ever be officially closed? Or should investigators keep fighting for answers no matter how much time passes? I'll be reading every single one of your thoughts.